Evil is the biggest mystery in human life. And as it's often pointed out, even people who don't believe in God blame God when they hit evil and suffering. Humans are the wildest and most dangerous animal. It's important to distinguish evil from suffering. Evil is evil, but it should have been otherwise.
Author Os Guinness explores the problem of evil and engages the age-old question, if God is God, why do bad things happen? Next on Day of Discovery.
Evil is the biggest mystery in human life.
Os Guinness was born in China during World War II into what some would call evil and troubled times. He left in 1951 after the Chinese Revolution. A graduate of the University of London and Oxford, he's written or edited more than 20 books, including one on evil, written after the events of 9/11, one of the most dramatic acts of violence in history. It's called Unspeakable: Facing Up to the Challenge of Evil.
Now, I wrote the book after 9/11. My wife and I actually had the date in our calendar because I was asked to give an evening's talk on evil to Wall Street bankers. And the hotel phoned us a week ahead and said, so sorry, we double booked. And so it was postponed. And then came 9/11. I thought they'd forget it altogether. But they said, no, it's more urgent than ever. And so we met a week after 9/11. And in the same hotel, the only other people were from Sandler and Neil, who'd lost more than 70 people in the collapse of the tower. We had in our group one person who got down from the 104th floor of the second tower, and he was shaken to his roots, having survived. Why not me, as it were? And you could have cut the atmosphere with a knife. The leader who introduced the evening, he said, I read some of these readings before 9/11. I thought they were rather dark for me. I read them again after 9/11, and they weren't nearly dark enough. And so 9/11 was the trigger for many Americans to rethink the problem of evil. The funny thing about America is it has at the heart of the Constitution, separation of powers, checks and balances, all built on the understanding of the realistic appreciation of the problem of fallen human beings. So despite the framers, the founders' realism, modern Americans are often clueless about evil. We've got notions like progressivism. The world's getting better and better and better. We've had in the 1950s Pollyannerism, plastering the world with smiley buttons. And more recently we got postmodernism. You can't even talk about truth and false, or right and wrong, evil and good. You can't even talk about these things. So when 9/11 hit, many Americans were clueless and confused. When George Bush said they were evil, many people at Harvard, you can't talk like that. And you can see how intellectually and other ways Americans were confused. And evil is the greatest mystery in human life, the greatest challenge of our modern world. And I would challenge everyone who wants to lead and examine life to think it through and look evil in the white of the eye and come out with an examined answer. There are no experts on evil. I've never myself been through terrible evil, but I was born in China in World War II when my parents did experience evil. They were married during the Japanese invasion when 20 million were killed. A little later, at one stage, we were in a place in north central China where we had the Communist Army on one side, the Japanese Army on the other, and the Nationalist Army on the third side, and there was a terrible famine. And due to the heartlessness of Chiang Kai-shek, 5 million died in 3 months, including my 2 brothers. My mother, who was a surgeon, she said she could have been a ballet dancer or a stockbroker for all the use it was being a doctor when there was no medicine and no food. Then a little later we moved to what was then Nanking, now Nanjing, the southern capital. It had just experienced the rape of Nanking, which was the most brutal, sadistic massacre in the whole of the 20th century. And then in 1949, when I was 8, I had the privilege of witnessing the climax of the Chinese Revolution and the beginning of the Reign of Terror, and of course the beginning of the terrible persecution of the church. So I was small, very small when my brothers died, but my parents had looked evil in the white of the eye, and they brought me up to have an understanding and above all a realism about evil. It's important to distinguish evil from suffering. In evil, traditionally defined, or has to be changed today a wee bit, is the intent to do harm. In other words, evil is active, whereas suffering is passive. People are the innocent victims of evil done to them, or of pain or health problems or whatever. So suffering is passive and evil is active, but they hit people in the same way and they throw up some of the same questions. So I think as humans, if we're to lead and examine life, we have to think through what's the greatest mystery and the greatest challenge of our modern world, which is evil and suffering. Step one, very simply, is recognize the sources. Immediately it comes into our lives, either suffering or evil, which are different, as I said. And they're through our bodies, through nature, and the worst of all, through our fellow human beings. And if we understand that, these little bodies of ours, we can admire great athletes or Olympic athletes or whatever, but we could have been aborted before we were born. We could have had genetic dysfunction before we were born. And there's 1,000 things we can face in life which would cut our life short, and any of us will suffer and all of us will die. And of course we know today the horror of, say, dementia and Alzheimer's. These little power packs that are our bodies easily run out, and we have to be realistic about it. The second source hardly needs underlining today. We live in a world where we see everything as it happens in the global era. So the incredible horror of the Southeast Asian tidal wave, the tsunami, or more recently the Haitian earthquake, you can see that in front of these great forces of nature, or famine, or tornadoes, or hurricanes, or earthquakes, or whatever it is, we're so vulnerable. The third source is the most horrific. We talk about wild animals. Humans are the wildest and most dangerous animal. So 1/3 of a billion human beings were killed by their fellow human beings in the 20th century, the most murderous century in all history. 100 million in war, 100 million under political repression, and another 100 million under ethnic and sectarian violence. And you can see we are most dangerous. So the question is not just, where's God? But who are we that the same species we are does this to our fellow creatures? The second step for humans thinking through the challenge of evil is simply listen to the questions. It's very important to say that all suffering is unique. In other words, you can't generalize in one way and never put people in categories and stereotypes. But having said that, when either pain or suffering or evil hit people, there are 3 questions that bubble up almost instinctively and irrepressibly. The first is, why me? The second, where's God? And the third, how can I stand it? Obviously, they overlap to a certain extent, but they're all very, very different questions. And they're the questions that need to be answered when one looks at the meaning of evil and suffering. Why me? We all love control, and we take the universe for granted. Terra firma, firm earth, and so on. And suddenly something strikes in and makes us feel rattled and nervous. And maybe there's randomness behind it all. 3 soldiers go over the brow of the hill, 2 are killed, and the third one's unscathed, except nightmares the rest of his life. Solzhenitsyn, 3 weeks from death, survived cancer. And he was left to tell what he calls the whisper of dying millions. I was in a famine when I was very small. My 2 brothers died. I lived. So you can say, why me? You can equally say, why not me? And there's that first question, because somehow evil and suffering picks people out, and there's an irrationality, there's an injustice. It's all unfair. Life is simply not fair. The second question is, where's God? Obviously something is terribly irrational or incredibly unjust and unfair. You've got to blame someone. Someone must be held responsible. And as it's often pointed out, even people who don't believe in God blame God when they hit evil and suffering. And it's important for believers to remember the greatest example of all is our Lord. Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me, abandoned me? In other words, even the cry of faith in the thick of the anguish of suffering presses out, where is God? And at that moment, Jesus feels deeply forsaken by his Father. But of course, there are many atheists. Baudelaire, if there's a God, he's the devil. Stendhal, the only excuse for God is he doesn't exist. Something hurts so badly that you want to hold someone responsible. And back of everything, as Camus says, we want to accuse someone, and finally we'll accuse either God or the heavens itself. The third question is, how can I stand it? And on the surface, that looks, and it actually is, very practical. And people in deep pain or facing horrendous evil, say being tortured or whatever, they want to have something to cling on to get through the night or to get through the day or whatever it is. I call often those things fridge truths, little things you can hang on to like that. But actually the third question is also the most philosophical. Because as Nietzsche said, and here he was right, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. And Camus put it this way, the ultimate philosophical question is suicide. In other words, when you consider suicide but you say no, then you're giving yourself a why to live. And if you have a why, you can hang on through the dark night. Primo Levi, one of the Auschwitz survivors, has a terrible story of the other side. And you may know that 47 years after Auschwitz, he took his own life. And many of those who could not stand Auschwitz were atheist intellectuals who had no why. At one moment in Auschwitz, Levi, as a prisoner, saw a beautiful icicle outside the window, and he thought, here's a cool drink for me, amidst all the blood and the filth and the muck of Auschwitz. And he reached out to get it, and the guard saw him snatch the icicle to the ground. And instinctively, Levi said, why? And the guard, with a brutal coldness, said, here, there is no why. And that's what Nietzsche says. In our modern world, there's no answer to why. And people who don't have an answer despair and often don't have a way of surviving. So how can I stand it is the tough one, philosophically and practically. The third step for people is to appreciate the modern transformations of evil. If the 20th century was the most murderous century, are we more evil or are we just more modern? Now the fact is, we're no more evil. Humans have been like this right down through the centuries, but we are more modern, and the modern world changes the way that evil is done. The first thing is actually mostly good. The modern world minimizes pain. Now, the invention of the aspirin and the discovery of anesthetics. So you can have humans in the 20th century live all their adult lives without any pain. That's good, except for one thing. We don't have a realism like the past. Say, even Queen Anne, Queen of England, lost 14 children in childbirth. I lost my 2 brothers. Now, very few Americans have grown up losing siblings. And so Americans, say, bred polyamorism. No other nation plasters the world with smiley buttons, and is typical of that optimistic, smiley, optimistic view of life, because Americans are very unrealistic because they don't face much pain, suffering, evil, or death. So that first transformation's mostly good, but with a downside. The second transformation our modern world has given us is a huge magnifying of destructiveness. People think, oh, the nuclear issue. Actually, not the nuclear issue. Fortunately, none of the monsters of evil, Stalin, Hitler, Mao Zedong, Idi Amin, Saddam Hussein, they didn't have the bomb. We do. It's a democracy that's dropped the bomb. But the real magnifying of evil is the way our modern management processes and insights and techniques So if you look at Auschwitz, it was run like a Volkswagen factory with incredible processes and brilliant efficiency and so on. And that's why millions of, quote, good Germans could take part in evil but not realize the evil they were taking part in. They didn't intend to be evil like the monsters intended it, but they did it. And you can see in our modern world, you can press a button at 29,000 feet and obliterate a village and not even think of it as a B-29 pilot, and so on. So that's the second way that the modern world has magnified destructiveness. The third thing is very important too. It's marginalized traditional ways of handling evil. So we poo-poo traditional categories like sin, or even today, wrong, and so on. And we have all sorts of modern psychological categories instead. But also we marginalize pastors and bring in, say, grief counselors. And when you have a tragedy like the Columbine shooting at the high school in Colorado, hundreds of grief counselors come in from all around America and teach people the 10 stages of mourning and so on. And people don't have the traditional ways of a community coming round them. And the end result is, with our films, things like Tarantino's violence and so on, we have made evil cool. And so put all these things together, the modern world has magnified evil enormously. We aren't more evil, but we're much more destructive in the modern world. We have made evil cool, and we're called a culture of transgression. In other words, in the past, every culture had its no-nos, its taboos, the things you didn't do. But the essence of, say, modern liberal freedom is break them all. Press the boundaries, flout the conventions, bust the taboos, show the violence, be explicit. And then at the end, you break down the sensitivities and you glamorize the evil and you make it cool. And that's incredibly dangerous. Here we are in this incredible world, and we're all trying to make sense of it. And suffering and evil are just an inextricable part of it. So we're all trying to make sense of it. I've spoken on many campuses, talked to thousands of people individually for many, many decades now. Some people are very genuine. They really want to know the answer, and they deserve an answer. Every genuine question deserves an honest answer. A lot of people are not genuine. They want to use the problem of evil as a stick to beat God with or whatever with. They don't deserve an answer. If someone would ask me a real angry question about evil, I'd try and say, where's it coming from? Nietzsche used to say that all philosophy is personal. In other words, I think in the last couple of years, I remember meeting a Southern Baptist who was angry about evil because his father had been a deacon who abused his mother, beat his mother. And he was angry because he transferred his hatred of his father onto God. Now, the problem wasn't the problem of evil in terms of God, it was the problem of his father, and you've got to sort it out. So all philosophy is personal in a sense, and so I would try and listen to the question and see if it's a very genuine one, in which case it needs a very honest answer. Now, there are a lot of things we don't have answers to. The whole book of Job is written to show that we shouldn't give answers when we don't have answers. The book of Job is the oldest book in the Bible, and it is the deepest biblical answer to the problem of evil, although much of what it says is actually an answer to false answers to evil. In other words, the comforters, so-called comforters, they have a simplistic view of sin and suffering. So someone's suffering, someone's sin. There's a one-to-one equation between suffering and sin. So Job is suffering, Job must have sinned. Own up to it, Job. And God says, absolutely no. And that terrible view there, which Job attacks, is actually not that much different from the Hindu view. You know, the Hindu view of karma, you know, as the Hindus say, a calf can find its mother and among 1,000 cows. In other words, your sin will find you out even if it's 2 generations on. And if you're suffering today, you have bad karma because something you did in a previous reincarnation. And actually, what the book of Job attacks is something very similar to the Hindu view of karma and so on. So Job doesn't give us all the answers, but Job at the end discovers when he's in the presence of God, that's enough for him. And Job's so-called comforters, his friends, are judged and condemned by God when they gave answers they were wrong and they were cruel and so on. So when I don't have an answer, I would say I don't have an answer. But there are far deeper answers than many people think. The fourth and absolutely critical stage is for people to look at the different interpretations, because we want meaning. We want answers to the questions that have bubbled up. And you might say there's 1,001 answers in the room. Far too many for the average person to look at. Then there may be 1,001 answers. But in fact, for all intents and purposes, there's a big three. And the big three are three big families of faiths. And I'm using the word family, the way philosophers use it. Faiths that have a family resemblance, because they all go back to the same sense of the ultimate source of reality. And when you see it that way, the big three families are these: the Eastern, which includes Hinduism, Buddhism, and the New Age movements. And they all go back to an impersonal ground of being. So if you say God, Hindus have thousands of gods. It's God with a small g, an impersonal ground of being. The second family of faiths is the secularist. Atheists, agnostics, materialists, naturalists in science. Think of, say, the new atheists now, like Richard Dawkins. And everything for them goes back to ultimate chance. Chance plus time plus matter, that's us. Then the third family of faiths at its largest is the Abrahamic, which would be Judaism, the Christian faith, and Islam. But in the West, we can mostly say Judaism, the Christian faith, the two biblical faiths which have put their stamp in the West. And of course, they go back to a personal, infinite God, and everything flows out of that. And when you look at the big three families of faiths, you see that when it comes to evil, they're not the same. There are huge differences, and the differences make a huge difference, and one needs to look at each of them in turn. The first family of faiths is the Eastern, and I would give them high marks for realism. Buddhism, a kind of religion-sized answer to the problem of evil. As Gautama Buddha says, affliction, or dukkha, is at the heart of our world. We're caught in a world of illusion. We have desire that takes to craving, that leads to attachment, and we're bound to this wheel of suffering. And in the East, the problem is not that you die. No. The problem is you're reborn. And you might go around, Hindus say, 35,000 times, and you can go down as well as up, and so on. So the only way out of evil and suffering in the East is detachment, renunciation. And what Buddha calls nirvana is the great deathless lake of extinction. So not only evil is extinction, you and I are extinguished. And freedom, moksha for the Hindu, freedom in both Hinduism and Buddhism is not freedom to be an individual. It's freedom from individuality, because individuality is what binds us to the wheel, and the whole thing goes on. So they're very realistic about the problem. I give them full marks for that. But no one can look at it and say there's a really profound answer. There's no vision of a world where injustice is gone and tears are wiped away. Because while the world is, it's a world of suffering and will never be anything else.